Good evening. My name is Kathy Crooks, and I'm one of the ministers here at Trinity United Church. And on behalf of our entire congregation, it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. We are always glad to share our historic sanctuary with any who come through our doors, and to all who are offering gifts of time and talent this evening in celebration and commemoration of Matron Georgina Fane Pope, I extend a very warm welcome. To ensure your safety this evening, please note the following instructions. In the event that we need to evacuate the building, please proceed to your nearest exit point. You will be assisted by ushers. We have 4 designated exits, 2 at the front and 2 at the back of the sanctuary, where many of you entered this evening. If you entered the sanctuary via the elevator or are using a wheelchair, or if you have difficulty exiting down a staircase, please do not attempt to exit via the elevator, but make your way to and wait in the narthex, the area where you entered off of Prince Street. And one of our ushers will be there to assist you from that location. To the band in the balcony, we would ask that you exit from one of the 2 exit stairs that you used to reach the balcony. And finally, to all, please note that the restrooms can be reached from either of the 2 interior stairs at the opposite ends of the narthex. They lead down to the lower level below us, and our ushers will be glad to direct you there. Once again, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Hank Stinson, and welcome to a very special celebration of 2 very remarkable ladies. Of course, Georgina Pope, a Canadian military nursing heroine, and Catherine Dewar, author and chronicler of her story. The purpose of this evening is to honor the life of PEI's own Georgina Pope, inspired by Florence Nightingale to become a nurse in a foreign war and firm in the belief that she was called by God to serve. She dedicated her life to nursing education, administration, and most importantly to her, nursing the soldiers and sailors of the King. It is fitting that this event should be performed in the lead up to Remembrance Day. Georgina Pope served in the military for 19 years. She was attached to the Royal Canadian Regiment as nursing superintendent during the First Boer War, 1899, and the Second Boer War, 1902. She established the Canadian Army Nursing Corps and was its first matron. She also served during the First World War in Canada, England, and on the battlefields of France. A free will offering will be received at the end of the evening, the proceeds going to the PEI Family Military Resource Center, a center which helps veterans and their families. Please stay at the end of the event to mix and mingle and enjoy coffee and cookies, for which there will be a small charge, the proceeds going to the Church Development Committee. Catherine's book on Georgina Pope is available in the narthex after the event, that's back there, and she would be pleased to sign it for you. Now, would you please give a warm welcome to the author of Called to Serve, Georgina Pope, Canadian military nursing heroine, Catherine Dewar.
I didn't write that into his script. He's not following everything. But anyhow, thank you very much, Hank. I may have composed the script, but this event would be just words on page. If it wasn't for it coming alive, Georgina's story coming alive through music, and the music of the PEI Regiment Band, which is up behind you under the direction of Lieutenant Rory O'Donnell, the voices of the Canada Remembers Chorus under the direction of Bonnie Hood, and accompanied on the organ by Helen McRae, and all the very talented actors you're going to hear tonight. Barbara Rodenheiser playing Georgina Pope, Hank Stinson, who's Lieutenant Colonel Langford. Doug Gallant is Georgina's nephew, Lieutenant General Maurice Pope. Paula Kenny, the wardrobe mistress, designed the female costumes. And thanks to the Confederation Center for dressing Lieutenant Colonel Langford for us. Thanks to Bren Simmers at Island Studies Press for producing the posters and invitations. And Lori Brinklow, down here, is the narrator who hangs everything together for us. So everybody who was involved in this production volunteered. Everybody. And I thank you all from the bottom of my heart. Tonight, you are welcomed into the sanctuary by this distinctive musical arrangement performed by Trinity's own Donald Fraser on the organ. Thank you, Don. This organ was dedicated in 1955 by this congregation in memory of the members who died and who served in wars from 1899 to 1945. So that's starting with the Boer War up to the Second World War. Other members of Trinity I wish to thank. They're here in great numbers tonight. Reverend Kathy Crooks for thinking this event was a good idea. Linda Dunning and the worship committee who approved the use of the sanctuary. Members volunteering tonight as ushers, Emily and Vance Bryan, Ann Love, and Dawn and Jeanette Scott. And we've got a video team here tonight. Again, members of Trinity, Mario Cerrone, Ben Cinnamon, Callista Tan, and John Inman. So there are cameras, you're being photographed. And I must thank, I don't see him here, but Andy, the custodian, and Ellen, who's our office administrator, for helping with technical and administrative things in the last couple of weeks. Now, Remembrance Week is a time for reflection, and I can think of no better place than Trinity to reflect upon the life of Canadian military nursing heroine Georgina Pope. I like to believe that her spirit is with us tonight, as are the spirits of her ancestors. Her grandfather, Thomas Desbresay, was one of the Methodist trustees who in 1810 procured the land for the First Methodist Church in Charlottetown. Her great-uncle, Reverend Henry Pope, was a minister in Charlottetown, the Methodist Church in the 1820s, and her cousin, Reverend Henry Pope, Jr., preached one of the dedication sermons 154 years ago in this very church. Now, the way that went, they had a church service in the morning, one in the afternoon, and one in the evening. I'm wondering if the minister would think maybe we should do that again. Probably not. So this church is coming up to its anniversary. It was dedicated in 1864 in November. Now, on this particular date, 100 years ago, Captain Matron Pope was a patient in Buxton Convalescent Hospital in Derbyshire, England, suffering from shell shock. Her 19-year military career was over. Declared medically unfit for service in March of 1919, she returned to PEI in June of that year for a rest by the seaside. Once discharged from the military, there was no community support for her. Pope, a veteran of 3 wars, would be so happy today to know that the veterans now have help when they come home. And she would be so pleased to know that tonight the money is going to a Veterans Association. She called her veterans her lads. So let's listen to her story. I will now ask everybody to rise for the singing of O Canada.
Georgie, as she was known, bounced into the world during a fierce nor'easter on the 1st of January, 1862, at the Ardgowan estate of her parents, William Henry and Helen Desbrizay Pope, their 7th child and 5th daughter. Born into privilege, the great-great-granddaughter of Thomas Desbrizay, the first Lieutenant Governor of St. John's Island, a daughter of a Father of Confederation, and niece of the Premier who took Prince Edward Island into Confederation. She was deeply rooted in the societal and political elite of Prince Edward Island. As a genteel Victorian lady, she was an unlikely candidate to become a nurse, especially a military nurse, since Canada had none. Her desire to be an army nurse in a foreign war was exceptional. Georgina explains why she had such desire.
Reading, as a young girl, a most interesting account of Florence Nightingale's noble work during the Crimean War, I became filled with the desire to become an army nursing sister and to go to the front. England being happily at peace, and I much underage, I was obliged to moderate my ardor. But with the main hope still uppermost, a few years afterwards, I entered the training school attached to Bellevue Hospital, New York City. I came with the highest of motives, combined with the most impractical and sentimental ideas, to devote my life to the caring of the sick. I am young and never have been away from home before. I have visions of bathing aching brows with cologne, smoothing pillows, placing a rose in the fevered hand.
But when confronted with the harsh and difficult duties of a nurse probationer, her first day on the wards, and with what she describes as tired feet and mind, she wondered if she could carry on. She prayed for guidance. Her romanticized ideas of nursing were replaced with a firm resolve.
My mind is filled with the dawning knowledge of sorrow, sin, and suffering of a great city. Sentimental ideas of being a ministering angel have faded away. But there comes instead a firm purpose to remain and devote these years of training, with their oftentimes unpleasant duties and disciplines, to the greater glory of God and the aid and consolation of those poor souls of His.
After graduation, Pope held 5 administrative positions in American hospitals and was on the ground floor of the professionalization of nursing in America. She instituted innovative ideas into nursing education. Recognized as an authority on obstetrics nursing, she was asked to present a paper to the International Congress of Charities, Corrections, and Philanthropy meeting in Chicago in 1894. After Georgie resigned from Columbia Hospital in 1894, she spent some time reflecting upon the type of nursing career she would pursue. She seemed to be at a crossroads, vocationally and possibly spiritually. In 1897, Georgie, when on a trip to Italy, met the charismatic Monsignor Raphael Mary del Val. That meeting would change her life. Under his guidance, she converted to Catholicism. Spiritually renewed and physically regenerated, she got a new lease on life and accepted a superintendent's position once again. But that position was short-lived. War broke out in South Africa. Georgina Pope was chosen to lead the Canadian nursing contingent of 8 to the South African War. It was a dream come true for Lieutenant Georgina Fane Pope. She was to nurse sick and wounded soldiers in a foreign land, just like her heroine, Florence Nightingale. On the 29th of October, 1899, she boarded the SS Sardinian with her band of 4 nursing sisters at Quebec City, along with 1,000 men of the Royal Canadian Regiment. From the deck of the SS Sardinian, she looked back.
I see the scene vividly before me. The crowded troop ship, the officials and friends on the pier, the music of the bands, the cheers of the crowd, the blowing of whistles as we moved down the lovely harbor. The autumn sun was setting, its crimson rays forming a wonderful background. Long after daylight had waned, we still could hear the cheers of the people who lined the riverfront and the sweet, rather heartbreaking strains of Auld Lang Syne and Home, Sweet Home.
After almost a month of being on the high seas, Nursing Sister Pope arrived in South Africa.
We arrived in Cape Town on the 30th of November, very much afraid that we would find the war all over. After a month on a crowded troop ship, the heat of the tropics, and the stuffiness of a small stateroom between the 4 of us, it was a joy to find ourselves at anchor in beautiful Table Bay, with its grand old mountains looking down on us, the sun shining, the blue waters sparkling, and boatmen with flowers and fresh strawberries enticing us.
I'm with you and you're with me, and so we are all together, so we are all together, so we are all together. Sing with me, I'll sing with you, and so we will sing together as we march along. We are marching to Pretoria, Pretoria, Pretoria. We are marching to Pretoria, Pretoria along. We have food and food is food, and so we will eat together, so we will eat together, so we will eat together. When we eat will be a treat, and so let us sing together as we march along. We are marching to Pretoria, Pretoria, Pretoria. We are marching to Pretoria, Pretoria around.
After being warmly greeted, Pope and her band of 4 more nurses would come 3 months later, were put to work nursing the sick and wounded from the battles of Magersfontein and Modder River. Pope had 4 postings in her first trip to South Africa, in one of which she was put in charge of British nurses. she leaves us with some vivid descriptions of her nursing experiences.
We arrived Christmas Day at Rondersbosch and remained almost 6 months, having at times very active service, sometimes covered with sand during a Cape southeaster, at times deluged with a forerunner of the coming rainy season, and at all times in terror of scorpions and snakes as bedfellows. I cannot tell you how brave and good Tommy is. It is a pleasure to run about for them all day and far into the night.
And many a night, Sister Pope stayed beyond her shift.
Such a nice man. And so ill, I fear he will have a hard struggle to pull through. I am oh so glad to be taking care of him, but my heart is sad that nursing and treatment have so little effect. I am waiting to see the effects of a powder before going to my quarters for the night.
Pope and 3 of her nurses were posted to Kronstadt, closer to the action than any nurses had been. On their 2-day train journey, they endured primitive conditions.
There was no lavatory, beds, or provisions for meals. Living in our lunch baskets and getting water from the engine for tea. It was easy to do that, as we rarely went for half an hour without stopping. Our faces were unwashed for these 2 days, and we had to attend to the wants of nature by means of a biscuit tin. Such is active service.
When they arrived at Kronstadt, living conditions were extremely difficult.
We suffer acutely from cold. Each morning, the hoarfrost is thick both inside and outside of our single bell tent. We are short of water and live on rations, which an orderly cooks for us on a fire on the veldt. A dinner is a very uncertain feast on a rainy day. Hanging in our mess tent is a copy of orders for all the hospital staff in case of attack, which for sometimes threatens us daily. Several mornings we awake to the boom of guns. I coped with the cold nights by wearing woolen pajamas, a dressing gown, a balaclava cap, woolen gloves, bed socks, and slippers. Once sufficiently dressed, I munched on chocolate, drank my ration of rum, and said my prayers.
Pope returned to Canada in January of 1901. That very autumn of 1901, the Canadian government decided to send another contingent to South Africa. She went as the senior sister, accompanied by 7 other nurses. The war was over in 6 months, and subsequently the nurses returned to Canada along with the troops on the Winifredian. After her service in South Africa, Pope was appointed to the Army Reserve. By 1906, the British turned the Halifax garrison, including the hospital, over to the Canadian Army. Pope was appointed as a sister in charge of the Cogswell Street Military Hospital. In 1908, she was appointed the first matron of the Permanent Army Medical Corps. She continued in that administrative and teaching position until she went overseas. In 1914, with the declaration of war, Matron Pope was one of the first to apply for overseas service. Instead, she was retained in Halifax, managing the understaffed and poorly equipped hospital, unable to have more than 3 days off in as many years. As well as administering a busy hospital, Matron Pope trained the nursing sisters who were posted overseas. In 1917, Matron Pope received the desire of her heart, a posting overseas sailing on the 10th of August, 1917 on HMS Missanabie for England. Once in England, Matron Pope had 5 postings, 2 of which were as acting matron in large Canadian hospitals. By the 23rd of December, 1917, she, at last, was with her lads at the front. She became matron of No. 2 CSH Outreau, situated along the northeast coast of France. Matron Pope was clearly enjoying her Christmas at the front, which the following explanatory and affirming excerpts from her war diary show.
24th December 1917. Captain Taylor's Minstrel Company gave a performance in the Red Cross hut. The dress suits of black satin with red facings were very fine and reflected great credit on Private Johnson, who cut them, and the sisters who made them. Songs, dancing, etc. were all very good. Sisters and medical officers sang carols in all the wards. Both of these entertainments were enjoyed by the patients very much. Christmas Day, 25th December, 1917. The wards were all prettily decorated with greens, mistletoe, and flags, with a Christmas tree and Santa Claus in each ward, giving gifts to all, turkey, plum pudding, and all the good things for dinner. The non-commissioned officers and men were entertained by officer commanding and officers, matron and sisters for dinner in the Red Cross hut at 1 p.m., and at 7:30, the officer commanding and officers entertained the matron and sisters at a dinner followed by a dance. Christmas was much enjoyed by all at No. 2 Canadian Stationery. January, 1918. The year is dying. None of us seem sorry.
Matron Pope arrived at the front at the very worst time of the war. The Germans were beginning to bomb the Canadian hospitals along the northeast coast of France, and by March, the Germans launched their spring offensive, advancing so rapidly some of the Canadian hospitals were being overrun and needed to be evacuated. The intensity of the air raids on unprotected Canadian hospitals increased. Canadian casualties increased, and hospitals were stretched beyond their limits in terms of space and medical staff. This offensive continued unabated until August. As was her nature, Matron Pope always tried to remain positive and cheerful in the face of danger. Pope Matron's war diary entries tell some of the story.
1st of March. March came in like a lion, storms of snow, wind, and rain. 10th of March, 1918. Beautiful day, trees budding and birds singing. 23rd March. A very heavy air raid beginning at 9:00 p.m. One enemy machine seemed to fall in flames almost midnight before "all clear" sounded. 31st March. Beautiful Easter day, but cold. Service very active, everyone working overtime very cheerfully, sisters doing splendid work, patients wonderfully cheery. 1st of May. The contemptible little army is still intact. Of May, beautiful day, convoy in and evacuations out. Air raid. 9th of May, air raid. 16th May, a Taube over at noon had a hot reception. 19th of May, beautiful day followed by a very severe air raid at night. 21st May, lovely weather, which gives a mixed pleasure and pain on account of raids. Window boxes filled. 23rd May, high winds and rain, a great relief to have clouds covering the moon. 31st May, we are filled with sorrow over the sad news from our hospitals up the line. And though little is said by the sisters, I can see the effects of their constant strain.
Pope was referring to the death of 7 Canadian nursing sisters who were killed during the raids. By June, Pope was admitting to being nervous, and within a month, she was sent to England for arrest. Pope returned to her unit on the 3rd of August, 1918. On the 15th of August, the Germans launched the most intensive raid so far. In 1.5 hours, 80 bombs were dropped, several hospitals were hit, an ammunition plant was struck, the railway dump and the British officers' headquarters were wiped out, docks were hit, and the casino hospital was set on fire. Pope heard the first alarm and knew the Huns were over the lines. With the second alarm, she knew the enemy airmen were over Calais. Then came the third, signaling that the Huns were in the immediate area. All lights were extinguished. Pope left no record of this raid, but nursing Sister Clint did.
An eerie silence awaited the first crash. It was not so much the noise as the concussion on the ground that was the most terrifying, and speculation could never be sure of direction and who or what had been hit. Once the bombs began to drop, there was the breaking of glass, bursts of shrapnel from French anti-aircraft guns, machine gun fire, and Lizzie, close at hand, increased the din. The sisters on duty crawled under their patient soldiers' cots. Those sisters not on duty grabbed their kimonos or coats, scrambled for boots, and headed for a very inadequate shelter.
It is unrecorded what happened to Matron Pope during this raid, but she was immediately evacuated to hospital and invalided to England. There, she had a diagnosis of debility, secondary to shell shock. She spent until the 26th of November, 1918, at a convalescent hospital at Buxton. In November, Matron Pope boarded the hospital ship Araguaia at Liverpool, bound for Halifax. Georgina was invalided out of the service in March of 1919. As a form of retreat, she spent the summer of 1919 at a Holland Cove cottage, the first of many summers that she would do so. After the war, Pope's home base appeared to be Halifax. She spent the summers on PEI, many winters in the Caribbean or Italy, until about 1932. At that time, she suffered a painful accident in Charlottetown and afterwards retired to Charlottetown and ceased to travel. In 1931, the Charlottetown Guardian described her as, quote, one of the wittiest and merriest of women in the life of Charlottetown. She was sustained by her deep faith and lived out her faith by supporting various charities and was particularly generous to her nieces and nephews. Georgina wrote an article in the Canadian Nurse about her war experiences. The old soldier nurse was longing for the past.
My hair is now white, and my blood pressure 200, a rate that causes great discomfort. In fact, I am long since a back number. But the sight of soldiers or sailors marching, a bugle call, the sound of drums or military band has power still to stir in me the old enthusiasm And once more, I long to minister to such cheery, grateful patients as the soldiers and sailors of the King. I owe my first desire thus, to serve my fellow creatures to the heroic example of Miss Nightingale of glorious memory. But I owe perhaps the greatest happiness that I have found in the profession to the thank you, sister, of the grateful.
She continued to have a close attachment to the military, always thinking of her lads, and they of her, so it seemed. She never failed to place a wreath at the cenotaph on Armistice Day in memory of them. In 1934, she received an invitation to the reunion of the Royal Canadian Regiment to which she was attached in South Africa. Longing to go, but unable to travel, she sent her regrets and a bouquet of flowers as a remembrance. She received a reply from the commanding officer of the Royal Canadian Regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Robert John Spinluff Langford, stationed at Wolseley Barracks, London, Ontario, dated January 25th, 1934. In a playful way, he reminded her of her old friend, S.J.A. Denison, who had been aide-de-camp to Lieutenant Colonel W. Otter, commander of the Royal Canadian Regiment in South Africa. In 1934, he was a major general and honorary colonel of the regiment. Langford explained that Denison had not changed much from his South African days, as he wrote to her,
I only wish you could have been with us. You could have kissed me and made Sep Denison jealous. He may look feeble, but he is still the life of the party. Insists on being kissed by all the ladies. In fact, just the same in that regard as when you knew him.
Langford updated Georgina on other mutual friends from the regiment and concluded the letter with a wish for her.
Well, sister, I hope when the warmer weather comes, you will take a trip up here to God's country. I'll not only play the regimental march for you, but I will put on a whole band concert in your honor. Cheerio, as ever, Bobby Langford.
About 1936, retired Matron Pope, unable to cope on her own, moved into a boarding house where she received care from Mrs. Tomlins and her sister, Mrs. Kelly. On the 6th of June, 1938, in the early morning hours, she slipped away in her sleep. She was waked for 2 days at Government House, the home of her cousin, Lieutenant Governor George Desbrizet de Blois. One of her nephews, Maurice Pope, a military officer who achieved the rank of Lieutenant General in the Canadian Army, son of her brother Sir Joseph, left this account of her funeral. Maurice noted that
her infirmities were such that her death could almost be looked upon as a happy release. As I entered Government House, there she lay to my left, surrounded by a bower of flowers. She was in her uniform, wearing her medals, with her cape and cap resting on the Union Jack, all according to her expressed desire. She might have been asleep. There was not the slightest indication that she had suffered or wasted away. She looked for all the world as she did when I last saw her 9 or 10 years ago. We were told a touching story. It was that earlier that day, a quavering old man had come to pay his last visit and begged the nurse in attendance to allow him to place a small medal in the coffin to be buried with her, because years ago Aunt G had nursed him, and in that way he wished to show his remembrance of her goodness and his recognition of it.
Maurice then went on to detail her impressive and most extraordinary funeral, a full military one.
The funeral procession left the house the next morning, 9th of June, at 10:30. The honor paid to the memory of a frail and kindly old woman by her fellow townsmen was touching to a degree. Heading off were some 70 or more nurses in their blue and white or pink and white uniforms and caps. Their inclusion in a military funeral was sweet. There is no other word for it. Then came an equal number of old sweats, members of the Legion, a noticeable proportion of whom were veterans of both the Great and South African wars. Then the firing party, a detachment of the local signal unit, and then the gun carriage, drawn, if you can believe it, by 30 lusty young island governors. I had seen this honor paid to the late king, and I knew it was done on the occasion of Queen Victoria's funeral. I know of no other instance. The relatives followed, and behind us came the general public. The Royal Canadian Regiment sent an officer over from the mainland to represent the regiment. I had omitted to record that the old lady's medals were carried on a cushion by an officer who took his place immediately behind the gun carriage. So we slowly walked in procession through the streets of the town to the cathedral, with crowds of people lining each side. The church was filled, and the Mass was sung as it should be. Following the funeral, we formed up again and set out for the cemetery, which is situated on a small rise of ground overlooking the harbor. The prayers of committal were soon said. A piper played a lament. The firing party fired their volleys, and the reveille was sounded. The crowds moved away, but I went forward to cast my handful of red dirt, and my last view was that of the coffin resting on the ground, still covered by the Union Jack, just as she would have wished.
In the words of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow from his poem, The Day is Done, who, through long days of labor and nights devoid of ease, still heard in his or her soul the music of wonderful melodies, such songs have power to quiet the restless pulse of care and come like a benediction that follows after prayer.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Catherine Dewar Fan Club, I would like to thank all the volunteers this evening, the readers, Doug Gallant, Barbara Odenizer, Lori Brinklow, and myself, of course, the PEI, the Canada Remember Chorus, led by Bonnie Hood, and, of course, our wonderful band, the PEI Regiment Band, led by Rory O'Donnell. Could we have a large hand today? Thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh, well. Better stand up. Thank you, that's very kind. We'd like to thank you all for being here this evening and invite you to join us after for some coffee and cookies and conversation. If you haven't yet made a free will offering to the PEI Family Resources Center, there are people available to help you with that. And of course, Catherine's book, Called to Serve, is available for sale in the narthex, just out there, where she will be delighted to sign copies for you. Would you all please rise? Oh, you already are. Stand. Okay. For God Save the Queen. Thanks a lot. This way, that way.
Thank you, Helen.
Splendid singing, Raymond.